Hello, welcome to Westminster's Social Justice Forum. Every year we organize our forums around a particular focus that we feel deserves deep and considered study. This year that focus is about how we can become anti-racist. As with our other forums, this morning's forum was pre-recorded and will feature a Q&A session at the end of our speakers' remarks. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Sam Grant, Executive Director of Minnesota350.org, speaking on just transition pathways, working together toward climate and racial justice. Minnesota350.org is part of the global organization 350.org, co-founded by Bill McKibben, who was one of our town hall forum speakers this past fall. 350.org was the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement, and its name refers to the highest atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide that can still sustain human life, 350 parts per million. Sam was named as the new executive director of Minnesota 350 in March 2020, one of many who began a new job as we locked down for the pandemic. At the announcement of his new position, he shared this: Minnesota 350 seeks to put communities historically excluded from major transitions, Black, Brown, Indigenous, Elder, Youth, Farmer, Low Income, and Union member, at the front of the shift to an equitable, clean energy economy. Sam was born in Washington, D.C. and grew up across the street from a pollution spewing plant in Pennsylvania. Developing asthma at an early age may have had some impact on his adult commitment to environmental justice, having experienced the effects of industrial waste personally. For the past 3 decades, he has taught at Metropolitan State University and other higher educational institutions, as well as directed on-the-ground projects focused on justice and well-being. Sam led the environmental sustainability program at HECUA from 2015 until late 2019, and served as founding president of the Sierra Leone Foundation for New Democracy, which is promoting eco-village development in West Africa as a response to climate change in high-impacted regions. As chair of Westminster's Eco-Justice Ministry team, I personally look forward to Sam's talk, because the environmental movement has not done a good job of addressing the impact of climate change, sea level rise, species extinction, and toxic waste dumps on communities of color and those without money or a dominant voice. Welcome, Sam, and I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you for all of you with the Westminster Town Hall Forum community committing to wade in the water of anti-racism and to trouble the waters of our current intransigence on being good relatives to each other. Now is the time for us to lay our burden of fear and lay down our burden of doubt in each other and doubt in ourselves to be good relatives, to commit to that journey with all that we've got. And as you know, we learn in African cosmologies, no matter where you look on the continent, we are spiritual beings in human form. And the French theologian, Teilhard de Chardin reiterated, what we've always known in African bodies and skins and spirits, that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. And because we're spiritual beings, we're capable of more than our tiny little egos think we're capable of. So I encourage us to move from the ego skin of separation to the eco skin of relationship. And if we can do that well, the many challenges of the 21st century will find that we have the necessary skill set to successfully navigate it and pull off a significant transformation according to the dreams, that we hold for each other. So I want to talk about this notion of ecological apartheid and ecological democracy. And this is a deep conversation, but it's going to go pretty quick to allow some time for questions at the end. And I hope it's just the beginning of an extended dialogue that we each have in our own spirits, because in the way I've been educated, once we've been in the circle with each other, we are actually in a conversation with each other that lasts beyond our lifetimes. So I look forward to being in this conversation with you all spiritually, as long as we are in spiritual form, which is infinite. So let's begin our conversation with each other. Wade in the waters, a really important, famous, and deep, Negro spiritual And I think that it is also a good entry point to thinking about troubling the waters of environmental justice and climate justice. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the things that I feel called to be in dialogue with you about. First is this notion of the structural violence of ecological apartheid. Some of you may be familiar with the phenomenal work of Vandana Shiva in India with the Navdanya movement, um, winner of the alternative to the Nobel Prize for her tremendous work around protecting seeds and promoting environmental justice on the planet. She laid out an articulation of eco-apartheid in 2013. And what she said, and this echoes what we have been saying in African communities over many generations, is that when we have created a way of organizing the world that divides us from nature, that way of organizing the world also divides us from each other. And when we live in a world that divides us from nature and from each other, we inevitably internalize living in a world of division, and we become divided in our own spirit. Our relationship with God becomes a divided relationship with God, no longer full of its potentiality. So as I think about climate justice and environmental justice here in Minnesota, I want to talk about Minnesota's contribution to this violent model of apartheid, which is a global phenomenon. So here in Minnesota, we're known all over the world as one of the greatest places to live for our environmental quality and also for our economic opportunity. So you see that we protect environmental quality and create environmental amenities for privileged stakeholders in our society. And we grow an economy that fosters stable returns to income and wealth for a minority of Minnesotans. But then you see there's a whole part of the pie, which is actually a growing part of the pie of people here in Minnesota who are not receiving those environmental benefits, but they are receiving an overburden of environmental injustice. And they're also receiving an overburden of economic injustice. So in Minnesota, while median income is close to 80,000 in the metro area, if you are in an African body, African American body, a Black body in Minnesota, your income is closer to 32,000 per year. So that's a $50,000 gap. If you are in a white body, your likelihood of being a homeowner is about 77, 78%. But if you're in a Black body, your likelihood of being a homeowner is closer to 27 to 25%. So a significant gap, both in terms of income and in terms of basic assets. As we think about the work of MN 350 around climate justice here in Minnesota, some of the things that have emerged in 2020 with the COVID-19 crisis and then the George Floyd uprising has required us to elevate and deepen the way we think about leading at the intersection of racial justice and climate justice. So that's what I want to talk with you about now. The environmental justice movement itself is a moving animal. It flows like water in a river. It changes every time you come back to it. So it's not a frozen definition of what we mean by environmental justice. When Martin Luther King Jr. went to Tennessee, to Memphis, to stand with the garbage workers who were striking for dignity and justice as workers, it required at that particular moment somebody who was a national leader of his stature to come in and generate a conversation because nobody was listening to the Black garbage workers. They didn't have a voice because the philosophy at that particular time is that if you are Black, you are not really a full human being. And this is after the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act are passed. But in practice, in Memphis, Tennessee, our voices didn't register as legitimate voices. So Dr. King had to come and share his voice with ours so people would begin to listen. By 1982, after a 4-year fight around a PCB landfill, people in Warren County, North Carolina, put their bodies on the line, and over 560 people in Warren County were arrested. And it was the largest mass arrest and massive civil disobedience leading to arrest since the late civil rights movement period of the 1960s. Through that moment, we realized the power of local leadership. So that was an evolution of the environmental justice movement. By 1991, Many of the people who had staged local environmental justice fights came together in a coalition and organized the 1991 People's Environmental Leadership Summit. And if you just go online, you can find 17 principles on environmental justice that were put together at that particular time, which I think is really important to metabolize as something that you commit to work with at Westminster as part of your own ethos and your own way of being in the world. For you to say, I live by these 17 principles every day. Here's how. If you feel like I'm not living by these principles, let's be in dialogue about how I can elevate my practice. I think that's an important commitment that we all need to make. It was a national movement in 1991. By 2009, at the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, after many years of saying, you are not listening to the people who are most impacted by the climate crisis, we finally had a massive climate justice uprising, which generated a significant beginning of the listening to the voices of climate justice. And so the power of the global movement in 2009 helped to shape the changes in the negotiation in 2015 with the Paris Climate Agreement to actually, for the first time, formally include the language of climate justice and to formally commit that the goal was no longer 2 degrees Celsius as the ceiling, but now the goal was 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was movement building at global scale that generated that outcome. And then, last year in 2020, with the combination of COVID and the George Floyd uprising, we began to see another evolution in climate justice sensibilities because world altering events crystallize our understanding that we really are all in this together, and it's urgent for all of us right now. So the opportunity is to honor what emerged in that moment of the George Floyd uprising and not backslide back to minor and narrow reform, but to really think intersectionally and relationally and bring together a big tent approach to fighting for climate justice that brings us all forward as good accomplices to each other. So move on. The climate justice demands that are emerging in world ecology are very clearly stop fossil fuel extraction, reduce greenhouse gas emissions to prevent temperature rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius, move the whole world along just transition pathways, heal all of our relations by bridging environmental justice, ecological justice, and treaty rights, and to co-create a new normal for what it means to be a human being is to be an earthling, caring for the earth, caring for all people regardless of geography, and facilitating mutual future care through ecological democracy at all scales across the entire planet. As environmental justice emerged as a sensibility, there was a clear articulation that we needed to share environmental burdens equally. And so the argument was that there is, because of environmental racism, a predisposition in society to overburden indigenous communities and Black and Latino communities and poor Asian communities with greater environmental justice overburdens than white communities. Some people made the argument that class wasn't as important as of a variable as race. And I think the work of the study done by the United Church of Christ, led by Dr. Ben Chavis, demonstrated pretty clearly that race was a fundamentally distinctive variable in determining who was going to have waste dumped on them. So our original articulation of environmental justice was focused on clearing up this history we have of allowing burdens to be inequitably imposed. Over time, what we're seeing now is that the sensibility of what we mean by environmental justice is evolving, like water flowing down a stream or down a river. So now as we think about environmental justice 2.0, as I'm calling it, we're focused on ending environmental pollution, not just the equitable distribution of harms. We're thinking about ecological reparations, which means if you have historically caused ecological harm in a particular community, that community must be repaired as a national priority. And then part of that work, because we haven't yet done the kind of beginning reconciliation that other people have done, we're saying that there has to be intercultural conciliation. We have to begin to have conversations about our experience in world ecology and name, using an open science paradigm, where we have inequitably distributed harms and how we begin to apologize for that and to begin to set conditions right. And by doing the process of setting conditions right, we're healing all of our relations and we're abolishing all oppressions. So the George Floyd uprising asked us definitively to take an abolitionist approach to police reform. And for obvious reasons, that met with pretty deaf ears by a whole lot of people who assume that we do, in fact, have a legitimate law and order society that does, quote unquote, protect and serve people equitably. And what the abolition framework is saying is that, in fact, that has never been true, and it is not true at the beginning of 2021. So we have to have a more open question of what we mean by the facilitation of law and justice and social order in a way that is truly intercultural. And if we can begin to have a much more open and intercultural conversation, then we can move into the middle of this diagram, which is to talk about just transitions and circular economies in a way that moves us towards a healthy earth, towards healthy people in relationship, and a healthy future that delivers on climate integrity and relational integrity. When 350 started as an organization, there were many people in the movement who believed that we could realize a change in the climate system by focusing on market-ready technological solutions. Over time, like the rest of society, 350.org has recognized more and more that we have to lead our work on climate change with a climate justice orientation. So we're asking people to move towards an intersection of climate and environmental justice as expressions of 21st century radical spiritual eco-humanism embodied in all scales of ecological democracy. So coming close to my close here before I get to questions, there's 5 questions or 3 things that I really think it's important to think about. We have to address the challenges. One is the failure to honor treaty rights. 2 is our terrible track record of racial injustice. The history of climate denial. Minnesota has 66 senators. 36 of our senators are climate deniers. That's unacceptable. That needs to change. And we just allowed Enbridge, a foreign company from Canada, to do the construction of the Line 3 pipeline. And our government here in Minnesota allowed it to happen. Our governor had the opportunity to support a stay on construction that his Department of Commerce had filed. When the Commissioner of Commerce, Steve Kelly, had asked for a stay, he was summarily fired by the Republican Senate. And he was replaced by somebody who wasn't willing to hold the line that he had firmly held for good reasons. He said no to Line 3, 1, because there was no verified economic demand for the line. So without proving economic demand, you shouldn't be allowed to do something just because it's going to make the profit for the company. 2, Enbridge, in fighting for the right to construct this line, had clearly indicated in their feedback with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that they had no intention of honoring all of the environmental regulations that MPCA had stipulated. And nonetheless, MPCA, even with that, did agree to grant them permission to build the line, gave them their final water permit and their stormwater permit. And we went to MPCA and we asked them very explicitly, how can you do this when we see it as a clear violation of treaty rights? You have 2 native nations here, Red Lake and White Earth, who were saying this is a violation of their treaty rights and they want you to stop it. And the state government said treaty rights are a federal issue. We have no standing on that. So now Red Lake and White Earth have taken that to the federal courts, and we're hoping we're going to hear a positive affirmation of their demands to stop construction, maybe as soon as next week. So put your prayers out for that to be a manifestation that emerges. The vision we're holding is carbon neutrality before 2050, that all Minnesotans benefit from just transition pathways, and that we honor treaty rights and normalize racial, economic, gender, and geographic justice here in Minnesota. These are massive shifts in our cosmology as Minnesotans that we're asking for here. Some of you might feel like, oh, this is too much. There's no way we could do all of this. But what we're saying is that we actually think of these as minimal demands coming from Indigenous and BIPOC communities here in Minnesota. So what are the critical next steps we need to take? We need to build and organize the loving, values-based relational dialogue revolution, where, like with the marriage amendment that won here in Minnesota and around the country because people went into deep conversations with people who were in deep opposition to sharing the world and sharing rights and sharing freedoms and opportunities. And that was a transformative moment. We are in a moment now where we have to move from a singular issue to a very holistic lens on sharing the planet in a way that gives both the planet and all of our degraded ecosystems and all of our people across the world who have been degraded by virtue of living in a world system that accumulates by dispossession. We have to start a new conversation about how do we actually co-create a healthy convivial future. And in order to create and sustain that healthy convivial future, we have to embody the paradigm of mutual thriving and share it broadly. So I'm asking a lot, but I do believe that not only is it the right thing to do, that we have the capabilities as spiritual beings in human form to pull off this massive transformation. So there's some innovations that we've done at MN350 that I'll quickly mention. Climate response innovations. We have a climate majority project, which has worked very hard to flip the Senate from climate deniers to climate affirmers, climate change, the people who recognize the need for climate change, moving for a 100% campaign that is locking in all of the mechanisms to make sure that we bring down greenhouse gas emissions by more than, or to carbon neutrality, and that we have all of our energy as renewable energy by 2050, and then a climate adaptation and mitigation policy framework that's really robust and implemented statewide. And then finally, we're also beginning now to do a number of climate justice focused innovations. So we've organized an environmental justice funding working group that is trying to make an argument to shift the way that environmental justice is funded in Minnesota from being something that gets less than 1% of money for environmental programs to being a significant source of investment. And then also moving towards a land justice paradigm where we're getting more of the BIPOC farmers with secure land tenure. You know, here in Minnesota, in this state, there's more than 110,000 white farmers, and there's only 1,300 farmers of color, and the vast majority of them are leasing land on an annual basis with no long-term site tenure, which means they're not building soil and sequestering carbon in the soil, and we're missing a massive opportunity around climate justice. And then finally, we're working to build a just transitions organizing framework in every region of Minnesota so that no matter where you live, no matter what kind of a body you are in, what your social or cultural identity is, we have designed a resonant process for a just transitions framework that you can say, this makes sense to me. I'm also excited about it. And I'm committed to being involved as a full-fledged partner in this just transitions here in Minnesota and around the world. So I want to say thank you for the time to be here in this dialogue with you. And now I kind of open myself to questions.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to unmute myself and come back and address some questions to you that have come up as you've been talking. One of the first questions that came up were what types of green infrastructure projects are under development in Minnesota, which are positively impacting intercultural or interracial communities?
So this is an important question, and I think the simple answer is there's not nearly enough investments in infrastructure. We have a few fledgling efforts led by entrepreneurs in the renewable space, by BIPOC entrepreneurs. And one thing we really want to see happen is that people get behind those efforts and more formally support them. We organized in partnership with the Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, and Julia Nurbin is going to be talking to you all soon. We've organized the Just Solar Coalition, which has made a commitment to have all companies in the renewable energy space secure 51% or more of their employees from communities of color, and to do procurement and contracting with businesses from BIPOC communities, also at that 51% rate. So if we're going to change the trajectory towards racial justice and away from racial apartheid, we have to over-invest right now so that we begin to reset what we consider norms.
Mhm.
And so that's some of the most important things that we need to do. Right now, I'm working on trying to do a documentation of very explicitly how much money has actually supported environmental justice in Minnesota, and working with an environmental justice funding working group I've created to significantly increase those investments. Bob Blake, who is a native entrepreneur who runs a company called Solar Bear, has developed new renewable infrastructure at Red Lake Nation, also on the Minneapolis American Indian Center, and he's begun a dialogue to actually get 600 Native nations in the US and Canada to all commit to being renewable energy pioneers, which means they commit to having Native nations that have been excluded from a lot of the benefits of the economic growth in the United States to actually be a key engine of the solution to the climate crisis by accelerating what's possible on native lands protected by our treaties to actually generate a whole lot of our renewable energy. So there's some exciting things unfolding.
Yeah.
All of those things need your awareness and active, enthusiastic support.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to say is, as you're talking, I'm making notes because I know our eco-justice team wants to have some different directions that we want to go to this year. So this is really helpful. Another question that has come up is, have Sam speak more about ecological reparations with a potential Minnesota scenario.
Yeah, so reparations is a word that people in privileged white bodies have kind of done what Martin Luther King Jr. said really clearly in his 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail. And he said that a person in the Deep South who is comfortable with their racism is going to give me an automatic, no way are we ever going to do that. But a person in a liberal body is going to waffle around a little bit and never quite give me a clear answer or practice true solidarity. And I'll assume, because they haven't said no, that they're going to partner with me to pull off this process of reparations. And at the end of the day, it's another bad check. And so what Martin Luther King Jr. asked for before his assassination in 1968, we're continuing to ask for that same thing. Repair is part of the journey of conciliation. And until there is a willingness to repair, conciliation can't yet occur. I'm pretty sure people want to be able to sleep at night, knowing that no matter who their neighbors are, who their relatives are in the community, that they're loved and respected, seen and included. And we're not practicing that behavior yet. So when we talk about ecological reparations, what we're talking about, to be really explicit, is to think about a community like North Minneapolis. Well, if you live in zip codes 55411 or 55412, you live, if you're in a Black body, you live 11 years less. If we calculated the earning of all families in North Minneapolis over those 11 years, and we thought about going back to when the Black community became a significant community in North Minneapolis, with the redlining following the removal of Blacks from the South through the changes in agricultural policy, then we would have to go all the way back to 1934 with the generation of North Minneapolis's Negro slums and say we have to calculate paying for those 11 years lost across all of those generations. So that's 4 generations now that would need to have repair paid to them, not counting all of the years of slavery before. Now, if we add to that, if you live in a Black community, you live in a space where wealth has been structurally stripped from you. You're not allowed to build wealth because Black space was treated as less valuable economically, right? Lenders wouldn't loan in Black communities. There is still a disparity in terms of income. Blacks have twice or less income than whites. We have twice or more the unemployment rates of whites. And if you look at wealth, we have less than 1/4 of the wealth of an average white family in Minnesota. So, and then you add to that the health disparities. All of a sudden, you're doing this complex calculation of all of the forms of harm that have been structurally organized to facilitate white privilege and Black pain. So ecological reparations thinks holistically and says, if we're going to live in a world of environmental integrity, that means living in a world that includes human integrity. Because white environmentalism separates environmental quality from human quality of life. And in our understanding of environmental quality, humans are part of that. We're not separate from nature, we're part of nature. So we have to be equally considered as we think about the integrity of the environment. So ecological reparations would have to do a calculation of all of those forms of harm caused and come up with a way of healing that. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to think, well, we have a lot of infrastructure we have to pay for. We got a lot of roads that need to be rebuilt at the end of the winter because of the solar fluxion. We've got schools that are in trouble. We've got a lot of families that are in pain because of COVID. We can't go back and write these giant blank checks to a whole lot of people who were oppressed in the past. We just have to focus on going forward from today. Well, if you understand, as I do, that the past is present, and until you deal with the past as part of the present, we're not yet having an honest conversation with each other, which means we can't allow us to think about policy as something that operates blindly based on what we can see right now. We have to have a dialogue through which we shape public policy together. And that would necessarily include making some investments in cleaning up legacies, toxic legacies of the past. In North Minneapolis, to close on this question here, there are 11 companies remaining. We closed down Northern Metals, but there's 11 other companies that are putting a higher burden of toxic pollution into the air, soil, and water in North Minneapolis. None of those companies are regularly violating MPCA standards. MPCA standards treat what comes out of each company separately. They do not analyze the cumulative impact on air, soil, and water, or human bodies. So the way we do environmental assessment is inadequate to the environmental realities that we share. So we have to upgrade the way we do science. And one part of ecological repair that is forward-facing is to adopt an open science framework where we have scientists and engineers work directly with communities impacted by environmental justice overburdens to document the way those burdens are showing up in people's bodies and in people's family systems, and to make commitments to heal those families and to create conditions in that community where everything that's continuing to cause harm is shut down and removed. So we have a lot of companies that are upset about environmental regulation. And they're saying, well, that costs me, and that means I can't hire as many workers. And what you really want from me is to facilitate job growth. So you have to make a choice. Either you let me grow jobs or you punish me with environmental regulations. Part of the argument we want to make in terms of ecological reparations is to have people no longer accept that it's a trade-off between jobs and the environment. The future requires an intersectional understanding using a circular economy framework, kind of like they've done in Northern Europe with the natural step framework that says there's 4 forms of harm we can no longer cause to the planet. Basically, we have to have a pollution-free economy. So that's a form of repair, is to say we've caused harm. At least now we can live by the precautionary principle and stop the transmission of harm going forward.
Just to follow up, how close do you feel like we're getting to a shift in this using the jobs versus environment trade-off?
We are not getting into that because our governor, by authorizing line 3, just proved that even though he has a climate cabinet that he's created, he's also allowed line 3, which is the equivalent of 50 coal plants in Minnesota. So we're clearly still doing the trade-off.
I just wanted to bring out that Elena just shared that Westminster is supporting the Minnesota Council of Churches Truth and Reparations work and 10-year plan. And from their website, they say the vision moving forward is to have a process similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it'll be led by the Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. Another question, and I'll read. Can you identify if research projects are being undertaken in both Minneapolis and St. Paul to document health impacts of pollution, polluting businesses on communities of color? He said he's heard reports recently of those protecting large industries that this relationship is just coincidental and not causal.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, David. Um, we have been in dialogue with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and with the Minnesota Department of Health. And we've looked to them to follow the example set by other regions of the United States that have done more robust work around sort of thinking about the intersection of environmental health and environmental justice. And so both MPCA and MDH have said, we're committed to that. We want to do that. We're still in early stages of actually getting some traction on moving results. So MPCA has agreed to help us organize an air monitoring organizing strategy in North Minneapolis to partner with high schools to teach young people how to do air monitoring in North Minneapolis and how to
Mm-hmm.
think differently about beyond being able to be clear on when the air is bad and how to protect ourselves. How do we stop the air pollution in North Minneapolis, because we have historically the worst air pollution in the entire state of Minnesota there. We are now um, in dialogue with African American leaders in St. Paul to launch an environmental justice coordinating council in the city of
Oh,
St. Paul that would be
okay.
similar to the environmental justice coordinating council we created in North Minneapolis. And we're hoping that group would then work with Ramsey County and the city of St. Paul and MDH and the MPCA to design strategies to actually reduce, to remediate the environmental justice overburden in those communities. So it takes longer than we would like to lock in these open science, ecologically, justice partnerships. Um, but we feel like at least there's a higher level of commitment than there ever has been before. And we think that as long as everybody who is at the forum today holds all of your friends and colleagues professionally and personally to account for this, that we'll see increasing traction here. Um, and I think there's actually an exciting argument to make that if we reduce the pollution overburden in North Minneapolis, it will actually significantly increase the way we express the possibility of mutual thriving.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question, how can congregations get involved in supporting their BIPOC efforts?
Yeah, so I know that Westminster has already sort of joined with MNIPL, and I don't know how many of you with Westminster are directly involved in the Just Solar Coalition, but I think to study what's going on with that Just Solar Coalition and to add value to that, to invest in that, um, and to go personally out to other companies in the renewable energy space and nudge them to honor the requirements that the Just Solar Coalition is asking companies to meet, and then to go to your utility and to challenge whoever you're getting your energy in your house to practice their own just transition. How many people are they hiring? How are they working to reduce the energy poverty, where people who live in poor communities are paying a higher cost for their energy than people in more well-off communities because of the long legacy of substandard housing in Minnesota? And if we want to address the substandard housing in Minnesota, how do we do that in a way that doesn't reinforce gentrification and displacement of the poor? So I think one thing to be really intentional about is to move from an expertise sensibility about social change and move into a relational process of co-discerning how do we create a healthier world with each other. So my ask of the people with Westminster is to enter into direct, consistent relational processes with people who are economically oppressed here in Minnesota, and to make a personal commitment to practice economic solidarity with families facing challenges in this economy. So in Iowa, which is a very homogenous state compared to Minnesota, colleagues of mine created an asset development strategy through faith-based institutions where 3 people in a faith community would partner to support a household that was trapped in long-term poverty. And the people who surrounded that family brought different assets to that family. Maybe one was good at helping kids commit to succeeding in school and to sort of sticking with a regimen of school success. Maybe one was really good at helping a family clean up its financial, legacy and
Mhm.
become financially literate. And maybe one was really thinking about economic opportunity and an asset horizon for the family to begin to have a hope in their own future. So I think here in Minnesota, we'd like to ask the faith community to play a leading role to anchor the relational evolution that moves us towards the ethical compass of what Paul Wellstone said, that we're better together. And if we believe in our deepest heart that we are better together, I think the minimal ask is to practice it in daily life and to cross the divides that we've co-constructed and allowed to continue to persist in our own lives. So if you say you care about racial justice, you have to ask
Mhm.
yourself at the end of each day, who was I in solidarity with that has a different reality than me? And if your answer is always zero, 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 then today is the day that you can cross over that divide. And it's as simple as thinking about, where is the nearest place where I could be the minority?
Mhm.
And how do I spend enough time there that people want to know my name and want to know my story and connect it to theirs? Spend enough time in a place that begins to emerge. And it's really not more difficult than that. So I think we made a lot of excuses about why we can't end our own apartheid. And the beginning of ending apartheid in the world is to end apartheid in our own relational ecosystem. So if everybody listening will do that, we can begin that journey. But beyond personal commitments, we really need people to attend to the ways in which there is structural violence that's creating hidden negative realities for too many people here in Minnesota. Attend to those patterns of structural violence as a collective, not just as a person, and make institutional commitments to be a resource to address those structural challenges. And then the world will change.
Sam, thank you very much for your insights and perspectives. We really appreciate all you've put into this and your challenges to us as well. Thanks again. We would like our listeners to come back next week when we'll be continuing the climate justice series. And Julie Nairborn, Executive Director of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, will be speaking on climate justice, interfaith action for root change. Thank you all very much.